sonido, sonido, sonido. Sonido, sonido.
Lina. Hi, Camila. Hi, Xingwen. Hi, Julia.
Good morning, everybody.
Hi, hello. Good morning.
Can you see us?
Yes.
Can you hear us?
Yes. Good morning.
Morning.
Good morning. Okay.
Good morning.
Hi, Simon. Good morning.
So,
Carolina, how are you? How's your health?
Yes, I'm okay. I'm surviving. I'm surviving.
You look good. Get there soon.
Good. I'm so happy to see you at least online.
It's good that you can join us online. So for today, we have panel 10 with the mainstream gender in free trade agreements, Latin American and the Caribbean experience. My name is Diana Maria Beltran. I'm going to moderate this panel, although it's going to be more like a relaxed conversation that we're going to have here. And it's my pleasure to introduce to you our wonderful panelists that we have for this topic. So on one hand, here we have Ms. Amrita Vari from University TAM. Online is following us Carolina Palma from Universidad de Costa Rica. Then we have Xingwen Sue, the National Shengxi University in Taiwan. And also we have Camila Villar Duran, the ESSCA School of Management, and Julia Lambert Gomez Ferraz, the University of Sao Paulo. Okay, so it's my pleasure to introduce to you to this really hot topic these days, because I firmly believe that the talk about gender, it's something that is need to be done in different areas, and it doesn't have to be only in anthropology or sociology, but of course in the legal, in the advocacy profession and in trade, because women beneficiate from trade as well, right? So let's begin with Amrita. Amrita is going to give us an introduction in general.
Sure. Thank you. So I have my presentation. Okay. Thank you. So basically, I'll just speak for a very few minutes, and then I'm super interested in sort of having a conversation with all of you to see what you think about it, because this morning we were just talking, Neha and myself, and Neha's working on digital trade, and thinking the problems are so common in our respective fields and they intersect. So I think we can learn so much from each other's discipline. So basically we thought we'll talk about how we can make trade agreements work for women. And this morning, when I was being driven to the campus, I thought it'll be super interesting to talk about 3 questions. One, can trade agreements really help? Or can they really be made to work for women? 2, are they helping women at the moment? And 3, how can we make them help women more in a way that they can help women overcome the barriers that they face to trade? So moving back to my first question, can they help? The short answer is yes. They have the potential to help. But let me take you a step back and sort of give you context of what we're talking about and why we're using trade and gender in the same sentence. I mean, so decades ago, we were thinking, we had the understanding that international trade, foreign trade is gender neutral, it has balanced distributive impact, and it takes everyone along. We have moved away from that understanding now. We are all talking about, in different fields and in our own respective ways, we're all realizing that foreign trade and globalization and liberalization has different distributive impacts. So globalization has taken some along, and it has left a lot behind, and a lot of groups behind. So in that sense, one of the groups that has been left behind, as per feminist economic scholars, is women. Because foreign trade has had negative distributive impact on women in various ways. the list of examples are endless. For example, globalization and liberalization has not decreased the tariff rates of goods that women consume. Globalization and labor-intensive industries in developing countries have increased feminization of labor. So there's this argument that, wow, trade has increased employment of women, but it has also increased feminization of women for labor because it has made the working conditions of women and their wages even poorer in labor-intensive developing economies due to globalization, due to foreign trade. It has displaced women from various sectors in business opportunities and employment opportunities because it has changed the landscape of economies in developing countries. It has decreased social welfare help that countries have because of increasing privatization in social industries, and decreased revenue that governments get from the taxes. And that has an impact on women's role as mothers, as social carers, because all these important crucial services have now been privatized. So trade has had an impact on women in various ways. And feminist economic scholars have for long argued that because trade has left women worse off, we cannot use trade policies and trade agreements to help women. And that is precisely the argument that I'm trying to attack in my research. As per my research, if trade policies and globalization and liberalization has left women worse off, that is precisely the reason as to why we should use these trade policies and regulations to ensure that trade can have, to ensure that we can minimize the negative impact of trade on women, maximize the positive impact of trade on women. It is precisely the reason as to why we should use trade agreements or partnerships or association cooperation sort of ties to make them work for women in a way that we can reduce this negative impact. And trade agreements can work, particularly trade agreements can work for a number of reasons for women. First reason is, no rocket science. Trade increases opportunity, economic opportunity for everyone, including women. Second, trade agreements are what? They are market access negotiation instruments. So using these market access negotiating instruments, countries can incentivize changes at the domestic level, at their own country and in their neighbors or in their trade partners' country. So they can use these incentivizing devices to bring about these positive changes at the domestic level, which would otherwise take decades or may not happen ever. And therefore, to my first question, can trade agreements help? Clearly, yes, they have the potential to help, but do they? And that brings me to this slide. I have looked at pretty much every trade agreement in force today, 450 plus trade agreements. And I tried to map the gender provisions, gender equality, explicit provisions in these agreements. And this is what we found. So a couple of things here, few countries are leading the game of including gender equality provisions in trade agreements. So you clearly see that North America, Africa, especially East Africa and Europe, they are the pioneers. They're loading their trade agreements with gender equality provisions. And then the other countries are left behind. So there are many countries which are sort of at the border and they're like, we are not sure. And then there are others who are definitely against this whole move. But then there are various good practice examples coming up, right? From across the globe. We have such sort of ambitious provisions, Canada, Israel, Canada, Chile, talking about increasing women's access to finance, productive resources, land. European agreements talking about increasing women's access to education, protecting women in violence and conflict, increasing their access to health services. Eurasian Economic Union talking about pregnant women's rights. African agreements talking about increasing women's representation in legislative assemblies. And after these agreements, especially after East Africa Community Agreement was negotiated, there has been a 60% escalation in the East African Community Parliament in women representation. So there are 60% women parliamentarians in East Africa Community Parliament. And that happened, that drastic change happened right after the negotiation and ratification of this agreement. So yeah, things are coming along, and we see that the focus areas of these provisions on gender are very broad. You know, they focus on labor, equality, non-discrimination, pregnant women, maternity, health, safety, childcare, economic development, education, skill development, representation, whatnot. And these focus areas somehow tell us that most of the provisions, as you can see, as per the region, are focusing on women in their roles as mothers, as employees, as social actors, and cultural actors. There are very few exceptions where agreements have focused on women's role as business leaders, political leaders, scientists, and other in other sectors which are more lucrative. And this is sort of a broad distribution of gender mainstreaming strategies that different regions have employed. So I don't have time to go through this, but just to give you an idea, different regions have included and talked about gender in their trade agreements in different ways. Zooming into South America, they have employed a standalone chapter approach where various countries, Chile, Uruguay, Argentina, Brazil, Colombia, Ecuador, they're including a whole chapter on trade and gender in their agreements. So wow, that's a big revolution. I mean, a whole chapter on trade and gender in trade agreements, which are about trade and market access. What are these chapters doing there? What are the benefits of these chapters? Why negotiate a whole chapter? These are questions we can all take up during discussions. But yeah, I mean, South America has a very interesting approach on inclusion of gender. So yeah, I mean, countries and regions have dealt with this issue in various ways. And then there are some countries and regions which are very active and excited about it. But then most of the countries, mainly developing countries, are shying away. They are hesitating to negotiate trade and gender, or for that matter, social sustainability provisions in the context of their trade policy. And that's one thing that I would really want sort of to bring it up on when we're discussing. But there are three common things, and that's where I end, that remain in all the regions, the way in which they include and talk about gender. And that's first, all gender provisions are promises. So they are drafted as best endeavor, permissive language, may, could, can, endeavor, strive, no binding commitments whatsoever. Second, there's no enforcement mechanism at all. So they explicitly say that these provisions are excluded from the agreement's dispute settlement mechanism. So if you include the commitment and you don't do anything about it, no one's going to go after you because there's no enforcement. There's no implementation. So they assume commitments on gender and they forget about it because there's no committee to monitor, there's no committee to implement, there's no finance, there's nothing. There's no operational mechanism included or accompanied or together with the gender provisions. Finally, these agreements are talking about gender or gender equality without defining the scope, and that also becomes a problem. We have already seen the problems we get into if we don't define these important concepts. Public morality, for example. National security, yesterday, we had the whole day on national security. We started the conference with national security. We don't have it defined, and that has made international trade law a havoc for us. I mean, we don't know where we are. So gender, just including commitments on gender or gender equality without defining as to what it means. Do we mean cisgender? So women and men by birth? Do we mean only women? Do we want to include a broader definition and go beyond cisgender? What is it that we mean? And if we don't limit the scope of gender in these trade agreements, I'm sorry, developing countries will carry on shying away from these developments in the near future, because this would just amount to fears of protectionism, of imperialism by countries which are more advanced on these issues. So yeah, that's all about what I wanted.
Yes, thank you, Amrita. Yes, it's very interesting, and I just want to take the last thing that you say. It's like when we talk about gender, what that we're talking about, right? And of course, I think it's nowadays, even though of course there is a progress on the fact that we have provisions within the FTAs related with gender, that doesn't mean that they are being addressed correctly. It's like I see it, it's that sometimes negotiators say, oh, I have a tick box and I have gender, check, it's there, but they are not addressing the real issue for people, for real people. So before going with Carolina, it's going to be the following presentation, I want to make some remarks related with Colombia and the Andean region. So I'm going to go through what you just say, Amrita, but I think that specifically in the case of Colombia, the whole topic of gender is new, and the approach doesn't exist in the way that it should exist. If we review, for instance, the history of Colombia, we are a country that is built on the back of women, considering the fact that we have been living in war for 200 years. So the whole economic, especially the rural economic system, has been sustained on the work of women. And still, they are not recognized in what they are doing. So the question would be how these women, rural women, are going to beneficiate from globalization. For that purpose, I'm going to bring you an example of a recent event. I think it was a year and a half ago, in which it was in the news, like a really big thing, that a group of women that grow rice were going to export the rice for the first time 10 years after the FTA with the United States entering in force. They were going to export the rice there. And it was something that was covered in all the media, everyone was commenting. The people that belong to this organization of women were being interviewed, and they say that it was a really hard work because they need to prepare technically a lot in order to achieve that. And if you see it from the perspective of the amount of rice that they managed to export, it wasn't that much. And actually for the organization, it was more like a moral win than anything else. So indeed, also the question is, it's the globalization for whom, and how do we understand these subjects? In the case of women, certainly, I don't think the topic is addressed in a transversal way. It's just a tick box for the government to say, yes, we are recognizing women, but what kind of women? What kind of genders? That is going to be the discussion right now. And also from my experience in my classes, when I reach the topic of gender for the purposes of trade, my students ask, oh, but the basis is no discrimination. So why talk about gender when the basis of the whole system is non-discrimination? Well, even though the question I consider legitimate, also I think the question implies that we need to know the kind of system that we have and how that system is going to work for people. There is another issue that I found in Colombian FTAs particularly, and is the fact that citizens don't know how to access the mechanisms that are implemented in those FTAs. And of course, women, rural women, are not taught how to use these instruments that are there, not like the women in rice. It took 10 years for them to reach that goal, but how many other organizations led by women are going to do it, and when they are going to reach it. So the public policy that is implemented in the matter of gender can not only be limited for women as mothers, women as carers, but also women as productive subjects in the whole economic system. Okay, so that's my little input. So Carolina, are you listening us?
Yes, absolutely. And I think I'm going to comment on many of the statements you just made. I'm going to present a presentation. So let me see here, and hopefully you're going to see it. I wish I was there with you, but I couldn't travel out of health reasons. But thank you so much for letting me participate online. Thanks to University of Externado. And thanks to my colleagues having this panel. So I am an associate partner with Ernst & Young, and I'm also a professor with UCR and Tech Monterrey. So what I wanted to talk to you was a little bit more on the business side and the private sector side as well. So we're gonna have all points of view here, I think. So we're gonna have point of view. Amrita, you just gave us like a really nice overview of everything that's going on regarding trade agreements. We're gonna have perspective on the WTO and multilateral and finance, and I'm gonna give you a little bit of the perspective of the private sector and what are we doing and what are we seeing. And maybe I'm gonna re-mention some of the statements you just made. So I'm just gonna go through them quickly so that we don't lose time. One of the things that strikes, it's that women-led businesses make just 15% of businesses that are engaged in international trade. So this is the statistic that covers everything you just mentioned, you know, so everything you just mentioned about women being left behind, women are not being or are not participating in international trade and so on. Gender gap in global trade will take more than a century to close at the current rate of policy reforms that we're seeing. This is according to various institutions, but yet closing the gender gap in trade will benefit businesses and entire economies. And that's what I'm going to elaborate on later. Some other statistics just to have this gender gap clear. Just at the WTO, there's one statistic that says only 36% of ambassadors and 30% of ministers in charge of WTO affairs are women. This was 2020, so it may have changed today, but I don't think it's gonna have such a change. But still, I mean, it's very, very few women. 1/3 of companies globally have no women in either board or C-suite positions at all. I mean, we're talking now in this century, right? And still, there's companies that have no women at all in their boards or their C-suite positions. And talking about gender gap and pay gap, you know, if we go there, it's going to be even worse. We have a pay gap. I have here one example in the UK, and this is a developed country. So you can imagine in our countries how it is. It's even worse. The pay gap, it's 14.9%. And women in tech, 27% more of pay gap. So that's when elaborating on Amrita, what you're saying is gender provisions only address some parts of some things that we women do, of course, that we do and that are important for us. But then what about the other parts? What about women in business, women in finance, women in tech, right? This I'm not going to go through this like a lot because you already mentioned, but there was a study saying that tariffs that are targeted to women's goods are higher than tariffs that are targeted to men's goods. I mean, just starting by that in the point of view of consumers. The point of view of workers, there's another study saying that when there's men and women that fight for formal employment, especially in developing countries, these jobs are being offered to men as opposed to women. So again, women are left behind, and this is especially in developing countries. For women that are entrepreneurs, is even more difficult. There's all kinds of struggles to gain professional recognition, access to finance, balancing career aspiration with domestic responsibilities, et cetera, et cetera. So it's even more difficult for women entrepreneurs, and that adds to your example also, Diana, regarding women rice in the rice fields in Colombia. And yet, there's also many other studies stating that if companies had more diversity, more women, if we were to engage more women, then the economic benefits of this would be so much more. And here are just some examples, but there's many more examples. So there's one example of a study by Credit Suisse saying that more than companies with more than 20% diversity have enjoyed better EBITDA margins, higher than the other ones. Firms with higher level of diversity, whether in management or boardroom, have higher share price returns than other companies with lower diversity levels, and so on and so forth. I mean, there's many other studies stating that if women are left behind, we're basically leaving 50% of the economy behind, because if we see statistics of women and men worldwide, is almost 50 and 50, right? So 50% of population is left behind from trade, from RTAs, from policies, and so on and so forth. So these are just some of the facts. Well, Amrita, you already mentioned about RTA, so I'm not gonna go into that. What do we have responding to this? Well, we have, yes, a little bit of RTAs here and there. We have some declarations, Buenos Aires Declaration on Trade and Women's Economic Empowerment. We have a number of institutions that deal with women's rights and empowerment of women. So we have the ITC, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development's Goal, Trade and Gender Arrangement, GTAGA, Women, Business and the Law Initiative from the World Bank, and we have many other initiatives that are going into the right direction, but we are not there yet, right? We just mentioned it's 100 years to close the gender gap. So, you know, it's going there on the right track, but we still have a lot of work to do. So what can we do? And here with just some examples and some ideas of things that we have been discussing, especially as I mentioned in the private sector, and that we have been discussing among companies, our companies, companies that we advise, and companies that maybe we work for. So one of the things that we can do is we can enforce standards. Governments, for example, can enforce standards through their procurement processes. For example, just to give an example, if in your procurement processes, in your governments, the companies that participate in these procurement processes should have at least 50% of women in leadership position in those companies that apply for those procurement processes, then we could see a real change, because then, you know, the companies are going to have to go out there and employ the woman and find the woman for them to be able to participate in these procurement processes. Or maybe we want to give an incentive. So it's not a prohibition, but, you know, companies that have women are going to have some extra points in procurement processes. So these are some of the things that are being discussed and that we have seen at the private level that really have an impact. We have also talked about better data. Well, this is something that institutions are working hard for. We have also talked about tailored training and facilitation resources to women. And here I also want to give you an example, a good example. It's from Costa Rica. It's the country where I live and I work. I work for Central America, but in Costa Rica I live. And so we have a governmental agency that has these programs called Aid for Export. And we have seen that when we have women quotas, or when we, you know, incentive women to also come and take the trainings and also come and take the facilitation resources, they would do it. I mean, women are eager to know and to learn how to export and how to go out there. And we have seen many women that have been brought into these platforms, brought into trainings, and now they are trading. They are trading to the US. We have an example of women, native Costa Rican, who were given trainings and who were given just some tips on how to do their trade better, and some also some support, and they are now trading in international platforms, trading their goods, which are local produced and local goods. So, you know, these types of things are examples that we want to see more and more. I know there's institutions, ITC, there's institutions in your own countries working for this. So this is one of those policies that we need to keep on there on the table. Develop models that speak to women, especially in the field of access to finance. Well, this is going to be dealt with in another presentation, but financing is one of the biggest problems that women have. Why? Because people lending the money in the banks are usually men as well. And so when they go and try and get a loan, not just because of the way the loan is structured, but also because of the people they're talking to, they don't see them as capable of going forward with their entrepreneurships or their businesses. And so this is a big, big problem that we have to address internationally as well. Other things that we can do, and here just to name a few other ones. I already mentioned about governments, but what can we do from our position to, you know, kind of like help governments and navigate all of this? I already mentioned about the public procurement clauses. That's one thing. Lobbying within governments for everything that has to do with policy, trade, and strategic goals to include more women, to develop policies that are targeted to women, to facilitate trade for women, and so on and so forth. Of course, leading by example. And this is something that we also, I try and do it. We try and do it in our own companies, but we need more. We need more mandates. We need more corporate responsibility governance so that companies would put more women in leadership position. And this would encourage other women and in governments also in key decision-making roles, and especially positions that have an impact on international trade, because then this is gonna also, you know, be a driver for all of the policies in governments, in businesses, in civil society. And so this is also something that we can do. And we also encourage, and this is something that I personally do, and I work with these companies on a daily basis, right? So we try and encourage the companies to create a trade function within their companies that recognizes the value that women-led businesses can bring to global markets. So in our advisory, we see how these policies in the private sector can also have an impact, not only by measuring them, but also by recognizing that it's very, very valuable if we have women-led businesses, if we support women-led businesses, if we support women in leadership positions, and if we also in this way push governments to have all of these policies and not just have all of these policies, but really enact the policies so that we can have, you know, less of a gender gap within the next years, and we can shorten the 100 years that they say that it's going to be a gender gap, and try and make it a less, you know, extended gender gap. So I think this is what I wanted to share with you today. It's more the practical approach, is what we work on, is what we've been working on, not just from a policy making perspective, because we as private actors, we also have a role in in policy making, and we also participate in various forums at OECD, within WTO private sector, within private sector, within our governments. And so these are some of the actions that we're taking, and within our work in our companies and in the companies that we advise as well. So yes, I think this is it. Thank you so much. And I'll be happy to go on with some questions later after we've heard all of the panelists, because we have to go through all of the different topics in trade and gender today. So
I was going
Thank you
to
so much.
suggest that
Yeah.
as Carolina has to leave eventually, so if there is anyone in the room who wants to ask a question regarding Carolina's presentation, it could be pertinent to do it now. Or if the other panelists want to make any question or any comment.
We have many more topics, and this is a topic, trade and gender, that is super you know, it usually has a lot to say about this. So if you don't have questions, that's okay. We can go on to the next slide.
There is one question. Yes.
There is one.
Thank you so much. I really enjoyed that, Sari Jones. My query is one thing that you mentioned about going in the right direction. What is going in the right direction?
Yeah. And can you take another question then maybe? So yeah, I was prompted by your suggestions on, you know, how we can incentivize private companies to, and how we can impose standards on them. What I fear is the extent to which we can really take it. I mean, to what extent can we push this? And as Diana rightly said, I mean, we believe in the model of one of the fundamental principles of global trade is non-discrimination. So to what extent can we promote or encourage positive discrimination is my question. I mean, I think to some extent, favorable treatment is important to balance the imbalance and level the playing field that has been disturbed by globalization. But proposing or imposing the standards of 50% of women on the corporate boards and companies for the procurement bids and such other sort of standards, would that not be pushing it a lot and could result in a backlash in the near future?
Mm-hmm. I think Amrita, and also to the question of someone sitting there, I couldn't hear your name. So I didn't mean this as a trade restrictive measure, but the other way around, as an incentive. So I think everything that we can do that's an incentive to promote and to support women that have been, as you have mentioned, Amrita, left behind, left out of trade treaties, left out of trade businesses, left out of trade policies. So everything that we can do to encourage this and have this the other way around, then I believe is positive. So this procurement clause is a procurement clause that would be intended, as an example, just to give an example, to support or to give extra points for businesses that have more women, and not as a trade restrictive measure. So not, in other words, that companies that have no women cannot participate or so on and so forth, but more as a way to give incentives. And I think this goes for across the board, also for trade, preferential trade agreements. So it's not about enacting trade restrictive measures, but it's more about giving support and giving, let's say, a push and giving incentives, of course, legal incentives. I don't mean like WTO non-permitted incentives, but I mean more in terms of trainings, facilities, cooperation for women-led businesses and women in finance. So, and when I say that we're going in the right direction, I just meant that because of the policies that we already have in place worldwide that aim towards having a better regulatory framework. And what are these policies? Well, the FTAs that we have, that Amrita just mentioned, where we have a few provisions, not many, but a few, the Buenos Aires Declaration on Trade and Women's Economic Empowerment. And we have the other initiatives, the GTAGA, the Women, Business and the Law Initiative. So there's things that people are doing worldwide. So we are going in the right direction. That's why I meant there's still a lot of work to be done.
Could I just pick up on this question, if I may? I've I really appreciate the Amrita's comment and the answer that Carolina provided. But I was asking myself, so we are talking also about the role of law in making trade more gender responsive. But what about, and we discuss a lot about regulatory law, but what about the role of private law or private entities? So in terms of business association or a contractual arrangement or policies, internal governance of these institutions. So how private law can also contribute to this aim, or the private actors creating mechanisms to contribute to this aim. So beyond public law mechanisms.
Yes, I think it's fundamental. We have seen in the history of the world that sometimes the private sector leads some of the initiatives that have been going worldwide, and sometimes international policies even go behind what the private sector is looking for, because at the end it's economic benefit for everyone, right? So I think it's crucial that we enact corporate responsibility in each and every one of our countries. I know in Europe, there's many countries that have already signed corporate responsibility standards. In the US, we as a company, for example, we have to report gender gaps in our organization, and we have to report gender pay in our organization. This is the US, it's a developed economy. You know, the US can do that. We don't have something like that in Costa Rica, as clear as that, but we should have it, I think. And again, Amrita, I think we should have it as a positive, not as a, okay, if you do something bad, you're not going to be able to, you know, trade ever again, but more like, as, are you moving forward and are you enacting the better policies for your business, right? So I think it's fundamental, at least for me. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. But I think one of the keys here is that the fact that it all goes down to business. We're talking about trade, we're talking about market access. So including positive social sustainability commitments in that sense, without making a business sense out of them, is quite ineffective, as we have seen. Because, I mean, labor and environment are two big examples of it. Labor provisions, the moment US connected labor standards with business case, they said that, well, labor interests are clearly trade interests, they're trade concerns. They made the provisions enforceable. So we have this rapid response, whatever, in USMCA, making labor standards highly enforceable. Then we have the environment, CBAM and other carbon mechanisms that we have. And we are now witnessing binding enforcement provisions in trade agreements on environment. And clearly, because we can directly relate this to trade. And I think for gender equality, for women empowerment, these positive commitments, Carolina, are very important, and I completely buy your argument here. But it'll be very hard for us to sell these positive commitments into trade policy, to trade policymakers, if we don't sell them as a business case, if we don't make a business case out of them. And that also takes us to another debate. Do we want them to be a business case, or do we want to keep them as pure human rights issues? So yeah, that's...
Or maybe both. maybe both, because there's business case studies. As I mentioned, the Credit Suisse one, and there's many other studies proving that businesses that have women in leadership positions are doing better also by having more revenue and so on and so forth. So it's proved. It's not just something that is a wishful, that we want to have because it would be nice, right? But there's also an economic reason behind this. There's the two of the reasons, I think.
Yes, before going with one pending comment, I just want to add, like, that's a problem that I also found, that the topics related with gender seems like it's an exclusive issue related with human rights. And only people who knows about human rights are able to talk about gender. And that's not true. we need to integrate everything in order to make it work. The public policy has to be integrated with all these different dimensions in order to actually work. So of course, the problems of women and rights of women are human rights problems. But from that point and in the practically seen, what we can see is that those problems are reflected in businesses, right? So if we don't adapt to that reality, then all these instruments that we are using are just there for nothing, basically. So we have a comment from the audience. Yes?
No, thank you very much for explaining. My name is Suresh Nanwani. It's for explaining about the going in the right direction, although I think it's something you might want to really check. You know, if you go to early 1990s, the Beijing platform, yeah, for women, and we're now in 23, like 30 years, like still going in the right direction. I think there could be a visitation of that issue, frankly. It's gender equality, and you said it so succinctly, right? It's 50-50, if not a bit more or whatever. So like something is obviously missing. I think part of it has got to do with a lack of teeth that Amita mentioned, which is really significant here. Use something about incentives to promote and support women. I think that's where I wonder whether it should be beyond that as a right issue. It's just not trying to say, oops, let's see how we can provide incentive to support, to promote and support women. Like, I think if that's the stand taken, the diagnostics have to be revisited, because it's just not saying provide incentive. Like, we are here, you are here, we are all here, you know, 50%. There's nothing to provide an incentive, like just do it. And a clear case would be, you know, you mentioned about the representation in your slide about women representation in C-suites equivalent. So if you just start off with a development institution, and you can see what's the percentage of women there, yeah? And then you break it up. Is it overall staff? Is it internationally recruited staff? Because that's where you really want to get into it. If it's going to be overall staff, 80% women, like, who cares? You want to see internationally recruited, because that's also equally, if not more important. And then if you have, I think you mentioned 30%. I mean, that's, you obviously, I think obviously there has got to be lots of work done, yeah? Not necessarily it's going in the right direction. 30% seems really bad. I think from my own reading at World Bank, other institutions like ADB, it's like 40%. So, you know, I'm not saying it's going in the right direction. So obviously it is, but there's a lot of work to be done, and you have got mechanisms in place, like, you know, gender equality, the gap and all that, to really address the situation. And when I say address, meaning address and redress the situation. I think it's in, you have the stuff, but I think it could be a bit more neat in a sense that there's so much to be done, and there's a lack of teeth. You know? Going back to what we said, which I really endorse. Thank you so much for sharing.
Thank you. Okay, thank you. So now, thank you, Carolina, for your presentation and all these things that we just have debated. Now let's proceed with Xingwen Sue. So Xingwen, you can share the screen and you can start your presentation.
Thank you, Diana. Thank you all. I have to share my PowerPoint. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
And do you see my slide?
Not
Can you
yet.
see my slide?
No.
Not yet?
Yeah.
Okay, I try to share my screen. So, and does it work?
Yes, now we are seeing your presentation.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Karima. Thank you, Amita. And thank you all, especially Diana. Thank you for organizing this quite marvelous event. I have our panelists have discussed many issues which I also covered, but for sake of time, I will just pass them because I agree all of what you said. But I have to raise three questions. I want to assess whether the WTO can really contribute to the women's gender equality, or what status are they right now, and what are the potentials? Could they move forward, or is there any barrier to stop them from doing that? The reason I started work on this topic, because in Taiwan, I find it ironically, we sit in a pretty high rank in gender equality, but in terms of trade, especially considering the cost of trade, we are at a very, very low level. The gender gap is extremely high, and because of that, I first aware that we, even in a country like us, we have a high gender equality, but we still do very poor in this respect. So I try to think about how could we solve the problem. So first of all, I want to set up some criteria to evaluate whether how the WTO can do, or how it was doing. The cause of gender inequality, or the participant have clearly pointed out, because we have inequality in tariff distribution, and most of women work in the less trade competitive sectors or companies. And for the women-led business, the entrepreneurs, they have problems. They have a problem with getting more finance resources. And they also have problems because they are being SMEs. So that's also the problem could cause them to cause them in disadvantage. And the other reason is the social economy problems, the cultural things. We have in some society, the women have to take more domestic responsibility and so on. So that set the goals. What we want to reach, that's the things we have to think about in the first place. So I would establish four criteria, four goals that might help WTO to understand what I really want to go, where we really want to go. First of all, maybe we can consider whether we should reconstruct the tariff structures, or we should simply raise the labor standards in female labor-intensive sectors, or we can help them to switch to a more trade competitive sectors. Or we can provide the general social environment which can support women as general. So my title would be change the social economy environment, or change the woman. So both ways could work. Then I will try to find out which approach might be would be more suitable. So I think we might have three different approaches. First one is, should we focus on gender-specific provisions, or like Amita has insists, all the provisions seems to solve and not even enforceable. So maybe we should consider whether we should go for a soft law, hard law, or a combination. Or we should do this on unilateral level, or we can do it plurilateral level through FTAs, or we should put it back to the multilateral level. That, in my opinion, if we go to gender specific, if we adopt gender specific approach, and we also include hard law, and eventually we put in under the WTO framework, that will be the most strong approach to reach our goals. So put it in mind, so I would analyze the current state of WTO. See, I'll put this at means silent, means WTO may not even have anything to do or to say about it, but eventually that could have some impact on it. And P stands for passive, which means the WTO might have a certain impact on that. I mean, by the virtue of the WTO agreement themselves. And maybe they sometimes this provision might pro or against the unilateral activity adopted by member states. And active, A stands for active, which means that you have adopted certain measures to actually encourage the members, either the WTO members or the FTAs as a group. So if there's anything that we can find that WTO actually take that approach. So for second time, I think the problem with tariff distribution, you can see even if many of articles, literatures have shown that economic scholars have indicate that the problem of female in gender equality lies in the tariff, but it's actually did not even talk about it under the current system. And I put it, that at most they possibly allow the members, if they want to change their tariff structure, then that would be okay, only if they do not violate the tariff schedule. And the labor standard, I think they also become quite silent on this issue. But if like Carolina had also pointed out, maybe the private sector would try to adopt certain incentive to make to identify certain labor standard or female friendly structures that might also help. But if we are trying to incorporate certain labor standards, then the TPT may come coming our way. So I think maybe the WTO would have something potentially conflict with the TPT if we read these provisions really strictly and we narrow the scope of exception. And trilateral, they're quite plastic. WTO typically, in principle, they will allow the FTA to try to move something forward. They would agree that they can adopt new provisions which are not even provided in the WTO. Then the market access and capacity building, this part would currently the WTO seems to be more helpful in this respect. For instance, we got Brianna Iris declarations, and we got S&D program, which also include gender support. And I put soft law because of the S&D, all the S&D provision are totally that you can cooperate, etc., etc. And the unilateral action, I think WTO sometimes they try to encourage or support the members to do that. For instance, they encourage people to adopt developed country to adopt GSP. And in some GPAs like US, they include an exception in their annex to the GPA. They said they would exempt the female supportive program from the obligation of GPA, which means they might provide a certain favorable treatment for the female-led business. And I put it P on SCM because Carolina keeps saying that we should provide more incentive. I totally agree. But if we provide incentive for the female-led business, that could also fall within the definition of subsidies, which would also trigger the SCM agreement. But SCM agreement did not have exceptions, and they did not have exception right now. So sometimes people will try to figure, is that could that be inconsistent with the SCM as well? And but for at a multilateral level, the WTO have aid for trade, which encourage the members or WTO itself to provide schemes to help help females as well. And the general provisions for the social economy supports. This part, I think normally would not fall within the scope of WTO because they are not specifically addressed to a business, or we can say this is general provision for all the females. So it's typically not prohibited, and the WTO could also encourage members to do that for trade. The next page. What happened? Sorry. Okay.
Shuang, you have 2 more minutes to finish.
Okay, 2 more minutes to finish. Okay, good. So that is my my ideas for. I think we WTO can move forward to put more emphasizing on the terrorist distribution, the terrorist structure, because the negotiation is on ALA, and they are trying to say that current the tariff on agricultural product might be too high, but their discussion was purely from just the different perspective, or to say, is there any protectionism in this area? But I think maybe people should try to think about the female is their major consumer for agriculture. So maybe it's a time to think about whether we should join these negotiations as well. And the labor standards, I think it's also very important to somehow to incorporate the labor standards. And also the market access, we have certain initiatives right now with SMEs and e-commerce. And the general social and economic support, we also have the possibility to include all the legal system. But the point is, why not? Why all these cannot happen right now? I think 2 issues would be 2 reasons we should try to think about. Because the WTO, they used to think themselves as a closed legal system, which try to isolate it from the influences outside. So, but who built this impression? Actually, the panel and the AB rulings, they keep saying these, but these rulings might not generally accepted by international community, because it's quite because under the BCLT or under the public international law, we all know that international legal system should be interacted with each other. So maybe try to think about, try to open the door of WTO to the other legal system, including gender, human rights as well. And we can also actively try to put the TPRM more active. For instance, they can, because during the review process, the chair can also provide suggestions for the members under review. So I think maybe they can provide certain instructions, or they can suggest the members could ask questions about the gender issue, which also can include, who could also make a difference when you actually read the TPRM's reports. And also maybe we should also think about trying to adopt certain interpretation regarding the provisions which might disadvantage or discourage the members try to adopt more gender-friendly policies. And also try to think about try to include new gender chapter if it's possible. But people would think, do you think these kind of things are too ambitious and too hard to become true? But I think the answer might not be no, because we all know the failure of Doha, this was 20-something years ago, the things have been changing. And I think the disagreement between the developing and developed country on change genders is not so great. You can also see many of the innovative gender provisions are signed in Latin American and many developing countries. So which I think that could be the sign to see that maybe people could reconcile on this topic as well. And in the meantime, we can also see that some reforms of the WTO is coming, and people try to think about the status of the GSP. Is that quite, is that still so authoritative, or should they be more flexible? All of which can people try to think about whether we should follow the old ruling or try to switch our mindset about the interaction of WTO and the other international legal frameworks. And that's my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Jingwen. Very interesting. So now we proceed with Camila Vilar Duran and Julia Alambel Gomez Ferraz. So you have 10 minutes for your presentation, and then we can have a set of questions for this second part of the panel.
Thank you so much. I know we are running out of time, so I will try to be very objective. I will try. So this article, this research paper I'm writing with Julia Ferraz, so she's here online too. I'm so sorry that I could not join you in presence. A little problem with my duplicate my yellow fever vaccine, so I'm sorry. So in this paper, we are trying to assess the mechanisms for gender mainstreaming, what we are calling here international climate finance law. And we are looking specifically to the work of the Financing Common. The Financing Common is a global summit of public development banks. I'm using here the name of public development banks for all development financial institutions, and how they are trying to build a more gender responsive climate finance. This new research paper tries to adopt a legal lens. And we started this work looking to the rationality of public development banks' operational framework for a more gender responsive climate action. So we wrote a previous work with more two social scientists, and now this is the second one that tries to look into the legal dimensions of the actions of public development banks. So here the main idea is that climate change impacts differently women, men, boys and girls. Different empirical studies show that extreme climate events, they impact more women and girls compared to men and boys. They usually bear the brunt of climate shocks, and climate finance is a key instrument for climate change action. What is climate finance? So the capital sourced and levered through international, domestic, public and private channels, so via government and market instruments. But we are looking here particularly to the work of public development banks, and specifically how public development banks, they are building their institutional commitments towards gender responsive climate action, and they are trying to build a nexus between SDG 5, so gender equality, and SDG 13, so climate actions. We could see that this is part of their institutional discourse. They are trying to build this nexus with different types of instruments, financial instruments, but also certain instruments with legal nature. And that's one of our arguments. So here in the first article that we wrote, we could see the Financing Common as a key global forum for this discussion. So how to gender mainstreaming finance, climate finance. So the Finance Common started to meet in 2020. So it's a very recent global forum, and 450 public development banks, they are part of this network. They organize an annual summit to share knowledge among these public development banks. And particularly in 2020, they signed a statement on gender equality and women's empowerment. And they tried to build this nexus between gender equality and climate finance. So for us, this is one of the main legal instruments they contributed to build to make to make climate finance more responsive to gender equality. And this particular statement was signed by 42 public development banks. So the quick key question that we are trying to answer here is how is the Financing Common summits, they are contributed to building the legal readiness to deliver gender responsive climate finance. What is legal readiness? So we are adopting here this expression that was built among different researchers from King's College, but also the United Nations Environment, UNEP Environment Program. So it is the degree to which a country has a coherent regulatory architecture in place, together with the requisite domestic technical expertise and institutional capacity to mobilize finance at a scale to address climate change and its impact. We can see that the financing common is part of this global regulatory architecture, and the financing common is contributed to diffuse this idea into the national level, using through global commitments. What is our theoretical framework? So we are adopting the idea that there is a particular legal field to address the questions, the problems that we are seeing. This field is the International Climate Finance Law, which is in the intersection between human rights law, international environmental law, and international financial law. We are adopting this definition of climate finance law, the matrix of laws and regulations, both domestic and international, that mobilize and leverage finance and investment for climate mitigation and adaptation. So we can see that this particular legal field, there is a certain legal pluralism and financial pluralism. Even from the actions of the financing common, we can see that there are institutionalized ideas and narratives, and the finance common contributed to create a community of practice around the climate finance action. And these particular legal fields comprise not only legislation and case law, but also financial and market regulation, statements, including these global statements made by financing common members, industry codes, contractual arrangements, policy and strategic documents, operational frameworks within financial institutions, private and public financial institutions, including indicators. So a way to measure how development financial institutions, they are delivering their commitments on climate actions, including on a more gender responsive climate action. So here in this paper, we are trying to build this legal framework on gender and climate, this nexus between both SDGs. And we can see that at the global level, certain ideas and legal narratives, they are built, and they have been diffused within national law. So we are trying to stress here the importance of this global commitment and how they are contributing to diffuse these also legal ideas into the national environment through different mechanisms. Why the financing common as a case study? We can see that's a very important political coalition in finance today. So since 2020, the French Development Bank, the AFD, Agence Française de Développement, serves as the role of secretariat of this summit. So we can see that it's almost like the G20 and G7, but with a more permanent secretariat. This fix was created by a key institution at this international environment, International Development Finance Club. And the aim was to align the global financial architecture with the United Nations SDGs and the Paris Agreement. So what we are looking here, what are the legal dimensions of these commitments, the different commitments of the financing common? So we believe that the different instruments created by this group of public development banks at the international environment, they are contributing to this matrix of laws and regulations on more gender responsive climate finance. So here, let me show with you one of my last slides to try to be on time. We are looking to these 4 different axes of analysis. So the normative power, the political commitment, coordinating mechanisms, and a mechanism for monitoring and making these global statements more accountable. And here we divided 4 key roles and instruments that were created by the Financing Common Summits. First of all, the creation of a community of practice among these development financial institutions, which has a normative power. Of course, it's a type of soft law, but this capacity of creating legal ideas, economic ideas, is very powerful at the end. Also, the summits, they are very useful to build this political commitment among different institutions. And it's very important to say these public development banks, they have different legal natures. Some of them are public in nature. Others also receive private investment and also invest in private companies. And they are located in different levels. Among these development financial institutions, members of this network, the fixed networks, we can identify subnational public development banks, national and also regional banks. And they are building to creating a coordinating mechanisms and align all these financial institutions with this aim of contributing to the effectiveness of the Sustainable Development Goals. They also resort, so shared knowledge, but also they resorted to the formalization of certain statements. And the statements on gender equality is one of the key statements created by the Financing Common. Here we can identify this normative power, these ideas, and I think I align with the comments made by Diana, but also Rita. This normative power related to the idea is again reinforcing the business case for gender equality. And the FIX is contributing to that, to reinforce this kind of narrative. And it's very effective in creating a political commitment among different bureaucracies. So as of today, 42 PDBs already signed this statement on gender equality and climate action. The organization of these public development banks was also successful in creating the 2X Gender and Climate Task Force, which issues guidance on how gender mainstreaming climate finance. So we can see a more radical mechanisms of coordination among these banks. And also this 2X Gender and Climate Task Force created the 2X criteria, which is a very specific indicator on climate change and gender to evaluate investments within these different banks, within the operational framework of these different banks. And we could see that part of these public development banks formalizing the global statement on gender equality, they are also adopting the 2X criteria. Not all of them, but part of them, they are trying to create more effective mechanisms, and they are resorting to these global agreed criteria to make more effective their global statement on gender equality and climate action. So we are trying now to build this matrix of law and different regulatory mechanisms to see how these particular type of financial institutions, they are trying to make, they are contributing to the effectiveness of sustainable development goals, but particularly the intersection between SDG 5, gender equality, and SDG 13 on climate change action. Oh, thank you so much for your attention. And me, Yula, and I, we are here to answer any questions and comments. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Camila. So now, I don't know if there is any further comment from our audience or our panelists.
Yeah, I have one. I think this topic is so fantastic. I really appreciate it from the various speakers and the various dimensions. I just want to go back to Amrita. I think there's so much what she said, and what was really telling was the lack of T. I just want to add more to the spectrum. You know, the definition of the scope of women. You could even have female-headed households that are so important that sometimes are not taken note of until it actually happens. And then you say, oh my God, like we miss them out. And, you know, it's just not paying lip service to gender equality, but if there's a female-headed household, all the more reason that should be factored in to see what can be done to address it. And that comes in various SMEs, etc., because the burden is placed on them, unfairly or otherwise, but that's a fact and the reality needs to be addressed. And then the elderly as well. And I just want to showcase that I had done a project before on legal education in an island country in Asia and setting up a law school, which is kind of interesting for all of us here. And at that time, before setting up that law school, there were only 3 female practicing lawyers in that country, in that island country in Asia. And by the time that project was done, in terms of implementation and completion, there were at least 40 female lawyer graduates. Now, I think that's telling, very telling. You only have only 3 female practicing lawyers.
I think the institutions matter a lot.
Yes.
Institutions,
something is
framework.
rotten in the state of Denmark, as it were, right? I mean, why 3? You have so many issues that come in, access issues, etc. So it needs to be addressed, and that's just a showcase of example.
For instance, in Colombia, the majority of students, or at least in this university, the majority of the students are female. But if you check the majority of law firms, the board are men. And I'm not talking about old men, no, I'm talking about kind of young men. So that tells you a lot about institutions and the importance of them.
Yes. I have a very brief comment.
Yes.
I'm not an expert on trade and gender, but I think this is a question I often get in my field, and I think this is a question for trade and gender as well. And the question is that when we talk about some of these frameworks and policies, the question that is always posed to me in the context of some of the issues and research is, how much of it should be really in the international trade policy or trade law platform, and how much should it be domestic law and policy? And it's often a difficult question to answer, and I think it's the same mistake. Because one could argue some of the things that were being discussed in the panel is the domestic legal and policy issues should not be brought to a trade platform. And that's why I think framing the argument, saying how this is of consequence to global economic welfare is very critical, because the WTO cares about global economic welfare, but they may not necessarily care about very nuanced issues of gender diversity in a particular context. So unless you can link it, and I think Mamta made that point.
Yeah, that's right, Neha. I think it's all about framing it right. It's all about packaging it right, because as you rightly said, as long as we can make the arguments, and I think there's a binary argument here. On one hand, as you said, it makes global economic sense for the efficiency, for the growth in GDP and everything. On the other hand, it makes a strong, compelling social sense, because globalization has had a lot of harm. So we need to undo the harm and repair the harm that it has had. So I think both point of views are very important for the framing for the right framing, because these issues are domestic. And when we include these issues in trade agreements, one fundamental backlash that we face from developing countries is, why? Why should we hear you developed countries? Because it's mostly the developed countries which are creating a lot of noise about sustainable development and trade agreements. Why should we hear you, and why should we include these domestic issues into international policy instruments? Because these are our sovereign matters. So we would not let you enter into our sovereign matters, because this amounts to intrusiveness, and it amounts to moral imperialism. It amounts to cultural imperialism. What may be right for you may not be right for us. So why should we follow your standards, especially when it comes to domestic policy matters? So that's a major sort of debate that we have to address. Why? And we have taken up these issues, and we are coming up. Peter was with us in this project. We're coming up with the first most comprehensive sort of compilation, a book on gender equality and trade policy. We are launching it in September at the WTO Public Forum, and it's being published by Cambridge University Press. So if you're interested in this topic, have a look. It's being published as open access, so you can download it online, which is great, because otherwise Cambridge University, they go insane with their rates. So yeah.
Okay. Okay, so thank you everyone for assisting at this topic, and thank you for panelists who joined us virtually and inside. Please enjoy the rest of the day.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.
See you soon in person.
So please, if you can join us for a coffee in front of the auditorium, and then it's going to be the first round table, okay? Yeah.